Welcome, everybody. And on behalf of the major environmental organizations in Vermont that endorse candidates, that includes VPIRG Votes, Vermont Conservation Voters, and the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club, I want to welcome you all to this special conversation with Lieutenant Governor and candidate for governor, David Zuckerman. Each of our organizations has its own reasons for enthusiastically supporting David's candidacy, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. But I want to start by just explaining a little bit about the format of how this will work. Our conversation today will start with an introductory statement, and then each organization will share just a little bit about our criteria for endorsement and ask a few questions of David. And then we'll have some moderated questions from the audience. And finally, we'll talk about what it might take to win in the next 10 days or so. So you can share your questions at any time using the chat feature that you see here, and then we'll try to read some of those in a little bit. But to get the ball rolling today, I'd first like to hear from our current Lieutenant Governor, David Zuckerman. David, could you share just a couple of minutes about your background? I know many of us are familiar with you. You've been a long time, for such a young person, a long time fixture in state politics here. But tell us a little bit about that background, your values, and what got you into this race, please.
Well, thank you, Paul at VPIRG, Rachel at Sierra Club, Lauren at VACV, and also involved with VNRC, and so many who have been supportive of this race with all of your endorsements. But, you know, I think hopefully those endorsements probably came from the long time work that I've been doing on behalf of our climate, our environment, and really tying those things to our economic well-being, because many historically have sort of tried to make a division of the environment versus economic well-being, when in reality, the two can and should be hand in hand. You know, I started long before I was ever in elected office, even before I thought I would be in elected office, before I even thought of running for elected office for that matter, as an environmental studies minor and then eventually major at UVM. I helped organize Earth Day in 1990. And what really sort of opened my mind to elected office was seeing Bernie Sanders speak in 1992 on the UVM campus. And I thought, holy moly, here is someone in elected office at the federal level who's really saying it like he believes it and doesn't take corporate money that often skews policies away from environmentally friendly type policy. And it sort of opened my mind, and I started to volunteer for him. I met other folks involved. In 94, I was asked to run for the House, and I did lose that race by 59 votes. I was still a student at UVM. But I won in 96 and started serving in 97. And since 97, for all but 2 years, I've either been a House member for 14, a senator for 4, and lieutenant governor for 4. And for much of that time, I was on either the Natural Resources and Energy Committee or the Agriculture Committee in either chamber, in order to really tackle environmental issues, whether it be water quality, whether it be air implications and the climate crisis. And of course, as an organic farmer, I care a lot about our soil and trying to make sure our soil is healthier, not more depleted when I finish using it as a farmer. And hopefully as a state, we implement policies that encourage good agricultural practices like more cover crops, which sequester carbon, pull carbon out of the air, put it into the soil, build organic matter, which helps capture the big rains so they don't run off and impact our water quality. And it's been working on these issues for now a couple decades. That has hopefully made some progress, but also really shown me that at this point, the progress hasn't been being made the way it needed to be, particularly these last 4 years, with the governor really having no vision on climate issues, vetoing the Global Warming Solutions Act, and really barely putting money into the programs necessary to make farming more profitable, tackle the climate crisis, sequester carbon, and really, and even in weatherization, the resources haven't been there. And as the potential governor of Vermont, we could really prioritize building our rural economy, investing in a climate economy, weatherizing people's homes, doing more renewable energy as well. And just a small fact as we wrap up my intro, and I can turn it back to you, Paul, we've lost in Vermont over 500 renewable energy jobs, particularly in the solar installation field, in the duration of the Phil Scott governorship. So when he talks about making Vermont more affordable, well, certainly for those 500 families or those individuals and their families, Vermont's not more affordable. For the homes that could be solarized, lowering their electric bills, Vermont's not more affordable. And there's just no vision. And we've got to get through the COVID crisis and be building with vision for the future for our kids. I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and we just can't wait any longer.
I'm so glad that, well, you covered a lot of bases there. We're going to dig in a little bit further, David, but I'm not surprised. And there is a lot to talk about here, but thanks for that excellent introduction. And now I'd like to turn it over to Lauren Harrell from Vermont Conservation Voters to share why they've endorsed your campaign and to ask you some of these follow-up questions. Lauren?
Yeah, thanks. And so appreciate everyone joining today. And thank you, David, for joining us. Really appreciate you making the time. So yeah, I'm Lauren Harrell, Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters, and we are a statewide, nonpartisan nonprofit that works to elect pro-environment candidates, advocate for strong environmental laws, and hold lawmakers accountable once they're in office. And we are just really thrilled that a true longtime environmental champion is running for governor. And, you know, this really looks back at many years of David's record in, you know, as he mentioned, being a state representative, a state senator, and a lieutenant governor. And he really has just been a true ally fighting for our vision for Vermont. And that is, you know, issues on environmental protection, public health, civil rights, social, racial, and economic justice, and strengthening our democracy. And, you know, David really embodies these values and has been a leader and ally in pushing for policies that move us closer to this vision. You know, and meanwhile, Governor Scott, perhaps even to the surprise of some people on this call, is racking up one of the most anti-environmental records of any Vermont governor in recent history. He has vetoed numerous priority bills of ours and stood in the way of many others before they even got to his desk. He vetoed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which we'll talk about more in a moment. He vetoed a bill that aims to hold large corporations responsible when they contaminate Vermonters with toxic chemicals. He vetoed a bill to protect children from toxic chemicals. He vetoed a bill to protect intact, healthy forests. And you know, I think Governor Scott's gotten a lot of credit for his leadership through the pandemic, but at this moment, we're really looking forward and how are we going to recover and rebuild from this crisis, and knowing that, you know, the way so many people have been harmed economically, and knowing that we have to be addressing the other ongoing crises like climate change, like racial justice, and so on. You know, there's a huge distinction between what Governor Scott is putting forward and what David Zuckerman are putting forward. And we're just really excited by David's proactive, positive vision for climate action, economic justice, racial justice, and more. So I want to start with a question for David about climate change. VCV, VPIRG, Sierra Club, and dozens of other groups came together this year and really prioritized action on the Global Warming Solutions Act. And for those less familiar, again, this is a bill that would hold state government accountable to meeting our climate pollution reduction targets, starting as soon as 2025 and ratcheting down to net zero by 2050. It requires a state to strategically plan for this transition, and in that planning, address things like rural issues, marginalized Vermonters, how they would be impacted and could benefit if we do it right and well, improving resilience, incorporating our farms and forests in this transition. And, you know, we of course know that Governor Scott vetoed the Global Warming Solutions Act, really the first significant climate bill to reach his desk. We've also seen no notable climate solutions put forward by the governor since he took office, particularly when we're talking about the scale and scope of action that really the science demands. You know, and in contrast, under the previous administration that prioritized climate action, you know, we saw the power of what the governor can do on this issue. We had the highest solar jobs per capita, clean energy was our fastest growing job sector. We had nation leading policies on renewable energy and more. So David, could you just speak to us for a few minutes about your vision for climate action and what specifically you would do differently than Governor Scott to address this critical issue?
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that. You know, it is paramount that we tackle the climate crisis immediately. One of the biggest reasons I got into this race is that the climate can't wait. You know, we are in the midst of the COVID crisis. We need to continue to handle it well. I will certainly listen to the scientists. I will follow much of the advice, if not all of the advice, of course, from Dr. Levine. I will keep him on in his role because we need that consistency. And really, if we look at where science has been followed with respect to spatial distancing and masks, we will continue to do a good job. So it's not like the governor deserves to be on a pedestal for what we've done in Vermont. We're just comparing him to Trump and the national Republicans, which right now is an abomination of following science. What's curious about following science is you also have to be consistent. And the climate crisis is a scientific fact. And to veto those bills that you talked about is really not the following of science. And this fall, when I was thinking about running or not, and I was thinking about the lack of action on the climate and this governor, I thought, you know, waiting 2 more years, which is what some political pundits thought would be needed in order to beat Phil Scott or to run for an open seat, I thought 2 more years of lack of action and leadership on the climate crisis is not acceptable given where we are in the climate crisis. We know we're past 350 parts per million in CO2. We know that Vermont has been increasing carbon emissions under the Phil Scott administration. We know that the resources he's put toward it, even with the electric car investment, which he has since cut from his budget, was paltry relative to the goals that we needed to meet. And so a big piece of my agenda, a cornerstone, frankly, of my agenda, has been tackling the climate crisis while creating jobs in our rural environment, which is where you tie the economic struggles of Vermont to the climate crisis. We could put people to work immediately, weatherizing homes of working class Vermonters and fixed income seniors. That would reduce carbon output by lowering people's fuel use to keep their homes warm. And it would put people to work in those jobs of putting in replacement windows, installing insulation, doing folks' basements so that they are far more efficient in their homes. We could immediately put people to work by changing the Public Utilities Commission rules on some of the solar issues around installing solar on people's homes, as well as net metered solar projects that would put people to work immediately and lower bills for some businesses, as well as, again, fixed income seniors and working class Vermonters. We could be putting people to work while tackling our climate crisis by installing broadband, something that's been a project or an idea of leadership in this state for a long time. But we now have the infrastructure with our communication union districts. There are federal dollars to leverage. There are dollars to use through those CUDs in terms of municipal bonding. And if we invested seed money into that, it would leverage those other dollars to really put people to work stringing broadband, which would allow for the continuation of telecommuting, but actually with service that would not be interrupted. And unfortunately, we know many teachers, many students, and many people trying to work from home have had a really hard time because we don't have broadband. So putting people to work and keeping our economy going and tackling the climate crisis are all intricately interconnected. And the last part of my Green Mountain New Deal has to do with affordable housing in our town and village centers. And if we were to build more affordable housing, invest in affordable housing in those areas, we would, again, be putting carpenters, plumbers, electricians to work, excavators, folks who are running those kinds of businesses. Get them to work, get money churning in our economy, and be building an economy for the future that would be tackling the climate crisis. So to me, they are so interconnected. I think it's hard not to see the opportunity.
Thanks, David. And I'm just going to ask one quick follow-up, and then I'm going to move to Rachel here. But as we, what has struck me about the COVID crisis is that it is a genuine crisis, and it is treated as a crisis, at least in this state. and I'm not going to get into how everybody else maybe treating it, but there's no question that people kind of have understood the severity and the need to act, and even the need to spend dollars and to do things that you otherwise wouldn't, and we have another crisis, that, as you just used the term, and we all have, about the climate crisis. It is an actual crisis, and itself having already major impacts on our world, on our country, and even on our state. Can you just speak to just how you think about that, and the fact that kind of one of them has been addressed as a crisis and the other one hasn't?
Well, having served in office now for 22 years, what I've come to learn, and I think it's important for all of us who might be termed activists or really engaged people in the political process, is that if something isn't affecting people in their day-to-day lives and they're not feeling it from an emotional and direct impact perspective, then it sometimes seems like it's sort of farther out there or not something that is relevant to them. And so oftentimes a crisis is more felt when it's viscerally felt. And I think what's happening now with the climate crisis is people are starting to feel it, both in their personal lives and because they're really seeing it more through the media, whether it's the wildfires out west, whether it's the hurricanes that are happening all over the country. We're more connected to people all over the country, so people might have relatives being directly impacted, but also we're seeing it here in Vermont. The weather patterns of Vermont have really shifted in these last few years, with a couple of years with serious drought, including this year with people's wells running dry, with agricultural impacts, with ski industry impacts, with shorter ski seasons, with the maple industry starting earlier and ending earlier, with different pests impacting our gardens, and certainly those of us that farm, we're seeing that. So I think the climate crisis is starting to be more viscerally felt, and we're seeing that more and more people care about it. But it's been something that's been brewing. It's sort of like the boiling frog metaphor, where you don't feel it when it's changing in a slow way versus something that happens really quickly. And now we're seeing the sudden impactful events, and people are getting more engaged. And that leads me to some hope. Today there's the climate march in Burlington that got postponed since last week. And a lot of young people are engaging. And I think that also brings me hope, because they're engaging, realizing that we have to make individual adjustments ourselves, and we have to impact the political process and the decision makers so that the broader societal power through governance is also an opportunity for making the changes we need to make.
Thanks, David. Now I'd like to introduce Rachel Stevens of the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club to share a little bit about their reasons for their endorsement and to follow up with some further questions. Rachel?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for having me. It's great to see so many people in attendees here, and so feel free to continue to put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll try to get to those. So my name's Rachel. I chair the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. I also, in my day job, am an environmental justice attorney. Sierra Club is one of the nation's oldest grassroots volunteer-led organizations. Our mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect Vermont and the planet. But most importantly, our role is to engage people and empower people to participate in the legislative process and to volunteer. We do education and outreach activities. We also do outings. So that's a huge part of our mission, is making sure people are engaged in environmental work and saving the planet. And David has been on the forefront of environmental issues, as Lauren said, and it's really exciting to see a statewide candidate with such a great history on these issues throughout his legislative career and as lieutenant governor. But one of the key things that stood out for the Sierra Club is his leadership and approach to leadership, which brings a diverse set of people to the table. One of the things that's really great about David's tenure as lieutenant governor is that he invited people into the conversation early and often. and was a frequent collaborator on events and activities that engaged the public on issues of climate change. For instance, we hosted a film series or with David's office that went around the state showing films on a variety of issues. And it was great to be able to be in an audience in Burlington. We watched the Devil We Know and talk about toxic and what that meant for, PFAS contamination in the state. David was right there and engaging people to then really connect dots about what was happening nationally, how that Vermont. Another great example of this area was when Sierra Club huge communities for the People's Climate March 17 through the streets on behalf of environmental justice, water ceremony, tribes, and powerful moment to hear him speak. So for us, Steve, it's really speak loudly. He's always brought people to the table, and that's something that really, hit home and strikes close to our mission. So along those lines, my question is, how would you continue to do this work of being inclusive and bringing people to the table, a diverse set of people to the table on these issues, particularly environmental justice and climate justice, which are so important?
Well, thank you, Rachel. There's a few things here. First, I want to say you spoke earlier about educational events that you do, and we've welcomed some Sierra Club groups here at the farm to learn about organic farming and farming's impact on the environment. And I've really enjoyed doing those tours, and I would hope that I might be able to continue to do those even as governor on occasion, because I do think Vermonters, we're such a small state, and there will continue to be those opportunities. Whether the movie series would continue or not, I'm not sure, but certainly as a governor, I will be hosting town meetings and town halls all over the state on a regular basis. As I opened, I spoke about Bernie Sanders really inspiring me to engage in this process of political involvement and even running for office. And when I think about what Bernie has done over the years with his town halls, getting around the state, bringing people out to have conversations with experts, it wasn't all about Bernie, it was about bringing the people with expertise in that field to have a panel conversation. And in that movie series that you talked about, that's often what we did, whether it was at the State House or as we traveled the state. We also showed The Devil We Know down in Bennington, because of course that county was hugely impacted by PFOA and PFAS. And again, it was very disheartening to have the governor veto a bill that would hold toxic polluters accountable, just simply for the medical monitoring of people that were unwittingly exposed, in that case for years, to toxic chemicals that could impact their potential rates of cancer and their reproductive health as well. It is mind-boggling that the governor would veto such a bill when he claims to be standing up for people who are vulnerable. To me, one of the peak meanings of the word vulnerable is when something is happening to you that you cannot thwart or stop. And certainly if you're unaware that you're breathing toxic air or you're drinking toxic water, that's as vulnerable as it gets in that regard. And the governor vetoed that bill. But what I would do is travel the state, having conversations with Vermonters. And it's something that I've done as a legislator. I've done, as you said, with thank you to Sierra Club and many other organizations on this call, as well as others around the state, helping make those events happen and publicizing those events, and really bringing together the intersectionality of it all as well. Because often toxic pollution happens in lower income neighborhoods more than upper income neighborhoods. And that in turn is also often reflected in racial injustice with respect to environmental consequences as well. And so having those conversations, connecting the dots for people, talking about why both their individual actions and our collective actions as a society, often guided by state and federal policies, how we can make these efforts move in a positive direction. So I will certainly continue to do that because I feel like that's a key piece of governance in Vermont, is that connectivity to people and the issues and that information, because Vermonters are smart. And when we sit down and talk and listen, we usually come up with good solutions.
Thanks, David. And I guess I would just say, as somebody who's had an opportunity to be in your office as Lieutenant Governor, whether it's a one-on-one meeting or more often, people crowded in. You're bringing in chairs from from down the hall or something, and these are diverse groups, with many different perspectives, and you lead the conversation, but seeking to genuinely hear from the people who are there. So I just have always appreciated that about you and how you operate, and how that office has been, a place where people can go, feel safe and feel heard, and have that opportunity to express their views, and also try to make connections that might not seem so obvious to others as well. So I want to thank you for that as well.
Thank you.
Well, so let me say, I guess I may have missed my own introduction at the beginning, but I think for folks who don't know, I'm Paul Burns, and I'm the Executive Director of VPIRG, which is the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, and we're the largest consumer and environmental advocacy organization in the state. And many people know us for the canvassers who knock on their door in the summer, and I'm sorry we weren't able to do that this past summer, and hoping for maybe summer of 2021. But we do a lot of work in the State House and with groups all around the state. There's one thing that folks may not know, and that is, since our founding in 1972, we have never endorsed a candidate for office. But this year, in 2020, that changed. And for us, it was really the climate crisis and the fact that there just wasn't enough being done to address it. That was, I think, a main driver for our Board of Trustees, who decided this year for the first time to get behind candidates and to endorse candidates who were committed to really making a difference. And as you've already heard from a number of David's answers already, he has demonstrated that commitment for decades already. Whether we're talking about climate or toxics or GMO labeling, David's been an outstanding leader. And so my question to you now is, maybe you've touched on some of this, but it goes beyond your position on specific issues, but more to that broader question of approach and governance. What could people expect from a Zuckerman administration in your approach to problem solving that might differ from the current administration?
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. And, I think our approaches are clear to those who are in the process day to day. But maybe for some of you who are obviously, can't get to Montpelier all the time or don't really see it happening on a day-to-day basis, you may be unaware. And Paul, thank you for touching on both the coffee hours that I had at the State House every Friday morning during the session, completely open door, come in no matter what your views are, let's sit down and chat. And I had a really nice note from someone, I think they put a letter together into one of the papers I saw recently, which said that they had sat in that room with 8 very different people who brought up 8 very different topics from very different perspectives, not always agreeing. And they felt like it was a really pleasant, positive conversation with give and take from everybody to really learn from each other's knowledge, experience, and perspectives, even when we don't always agree. And I think that was reflective of my broader system and philosophy, which is that if we don't bring different perspectives to the table, we're not going to get the nuggets that bring the best ideas all together in a collective policy. And often Vermonters or anybody feels like if a policy comes down that ultimately they disagree with, if they feel like they never had a voice in the process or that it was jammed down their throat, it tastes really different as a citizen in the state than if a thought and a perspective was heard, if a piece of it was taken into the process and the conversation. I think that's where we really thrive in Vermont. And I feel very fortunate. I grew up in suburban Boston originally, as well as in the summers in deeply conservative rural Virginia for a couple of months every summer with friends and mentors who had very different outlooks on life than I did. And I really learned and worked to understand, where were they coming from? What was their upbringing that gave them that perspective? Why do they have the perspective they did, rather than say, you're wrong for having the perspective you have? And I think one of the things we're seeing a lot in society these days is I'm right, you're wrong mentality, back and forth. And social media, I think, has really blown this up in a way that's incredibly damaging to our society, to our democracy and to discourse. And when I think about the current governor and myself, I think about his own statement a month after we were both elected in 2016, when I met in his transition office at his request. And he said, you know what, Lieutenant Governor, I'm not going to include you in any cabinet meetings. We're not going to work together during the duration that we are in office. And I thought that was a really big missed opportunity, given that the governor is a decent person. I like him personally, that I could have been in meetings where I might offer a different opinion. I would probably be outvoted. He's the governor, I'm lieutenant governor, but I might bring a different perspective that would help them to draft and develop better policy. And unfortunately, his philosophy was surround myself with people who think like me and have the same set of views on everything. And he couches it as chemistry. In a recent debate, when it was talked about me not being a part of the COVID response, which I thought was a real abrogation of responsibility by the governor, because it's my job as lieutenant governor to be ready to fit in immediately when, and if, hopefully not, he were to become incapacitated. And in the middle of a crisis, you need as smooth and as quick a transition as possible. And he continued his process of not having me in those meetings to understand what was going on. And so in the end, I would say an inclusionary approach with different voices at the table to make sure we're hearing and including nuggets that everybody can bring would be very different than the current administration.
Thanks, David. And I think we're going to begin to get at some of the questions that folks are sending in. And Lauren, do you have something to start us off?
Yeah, I wanted to go a little bit deeper into an issue that has come up already, but that is the issue of protecting Vermonters from toxic chemicals. You know, and again, this issue really, I think, came front and center for a lot of Vermonters when we found the toxic PFAS contamination in our neighbors' drinking water wells in Bennington, and we've been finding more of it through more testing. And of course, this issue's been, you know, something that the legislature and something that David has addressed in a number of different policies through the years. And Governor Scott's also amassed a record on it. And you know, just wanted to revisit a little. So one of the big issues that the legislature's worked on in recent years is protecting children from toxic chemicals and really getting at what chemicals are being used in our kids' products that are sold in Vermont. And there was a bill, gosh, when was that? 2015, back in the day, where when Phil Scott was lieutenant governor, he cast a tie-breaking vote that actually killed that bill for the year that aimed to better protect children from toxic chemicals. And then in his first term as governor, he vetoed a bill to protect children from toxics in products sold to children. And you know, another policy that was touched on earlier, but just to underscore, was this medical monitoring policy. So victims of toxic contamination, you know, drinking water from a contaminated well from a nearby corporate polluter, you know, the question of who should pay for that medical monitoring so that somebody could catch a disease as early as possible. Is it the victim who should pay, or is it that polluter? And when that bill got to the governor's desk, he vetoed it, really citing concerns about its impacts on businesses. And just wanted to give David a chance to speak a little bit more about how you would approach these issues and how you would work to address toxic chemicals and protecting Vermonters' health.
Well, I think it's, you know, a really great question. And the blunt answer is, I'm going to put people first. And what we find so often is this business versus people discussion. But what that does is it says, we're okay with some harms happening down the line, so long as we, you know, keep a business here. And we're seeing the outcome of that mindset of the last 20, 30, 40 years, which is polluted water, which is a climate in crisis, which is toxics in people's drinking water, toxics in kids' toys. And we're seeing more kids with, you know, ADD or other learning struggles and challenges. And some of those are due to economic circumstances and whatnot. And some of those are very likely due to various exposures that we've had and sort of genetic adjustments that are happening to our society because of all the things we're exposed to. So if we are not thinking about how we are driving costs to humans and costs economically into the system in the out years, by making these short-term decisions, then we are failing our society as leaders. And so when I look at, you just mentioned multiple bills the governor vetoed. Just in case some of the people watching this are unaware, the governor has vetoed 20 different bills in the last 4 years. That's more bills than any governor in a 4-year period. And it's only one shy of tying the record, which was Howard Dean, but he did it in 12 years. So the per year average for this governor is way more than double, often triple any other governor in history. So think about that. Again, for some of you who might be thinking, well, I want to thank the governor for how we're doing with COVID. Voting has consequences. And we can do well with COVID, whether it's a Scott administration or a Zuckerman administration, but we're not going to do as well on toxic issues, on the climate issues, on racial injustice issues, on the broad range of environmental and economic justice issues, on sustainable agriculture, and really a vision for the future. And so when it comes to toxics, for instance, a vision for the future is, let's work towards creating toys that aren't toxic for our kids. I mean, that shouldn't be a hard concept to get behind. So that is one of the sort of cornerstones of how I'll look at things is, what is the impact on people? And how do we make sure to give people the tools and empowerment and financial resources to do well for themselves without it being through also poisoning themselves wittingly or unwittingly as we lead through life.
Thanks, David. And Rachel, I think you have a question.
Yeah, this is a question from Diane, who's in the audience. She wanted to ask you, David, so you being a farmer and if you were governor, how would you change Vermont farms to lower carbon and methane emissions?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. I'm really excited all the questions coming up, and they're flying up on the screen down there somewhere in the corner faster than I can see them. And I'm thankful that people are so interested, and I'm sure on Facebook people are putting in questions as well. And I just want to remind people that if questions don't get answered because we don't run out of time, you can also reach out to my campaign at Zuckerman4VT.com. That's the website, and info@Zuckerman4VT.com with a question that we could then follow up on. And maybe someone can post that on the Facebook comments as well as the chat group here in the webinar. But I just wanted to then answer your question with respect to agriculture. I see agriculture as being one of the forefront opportunities to tackle the climate crisis. In a recent debate, the governor said, well, we're doing what we can for the climate crisis. Electric vehicles are a big part of that, although he then cut the money out supporting electric vehicles. He also is going to save the world with electric vehicles, except he's going to do it on a timeline that's about 100 years when we need to do it in about 5 with respect to the amount of money he had been putting into electric vehicles. But for me, the rest of his answer in that debate was, we need to let the technology evolve to tackle the climate crisis. To me, that is not seeing the crisis for the scale and importance and the timeline that it really exists. And agriculture is the technology to sequester carbon in a way unlike any other. Growing cover crops and really expanding the support to farmers for growing cover crops is a huge way to tackle the climate crisis. For those that don't know, a cover crop is a broad crop over your land that grows quickly, like grasses or hays or cover crops like rye and clover, that as they grow, they pull carbon out of the air. That's what plants do. They breathe carbon dioxide, we breathe oxygen. They put out oxygen, we put out carbon dioxide. So if we have plants all over the landscape pulling carbon out of the air, then we put it into the soil. Not always cut it for animals, but put it into the soil. We build organic matter in the soil, which means carbon from the air going into the soil. If we, this administration has talked about payment for ecosystem services. That's been the lingo with respect to how to do this, but they've been talking about it for 2 years and they haven't been doing it because, yes, it's going to cost money. And the question is, in our unequal society, with respect to income distribution, income earning, wealth distribution from both racist policies for hundreds of years, as well as through our own, tax systems. If we don't start to address that inequality, we're not going to address carbon inequality in the atmosphere. We're not going to put money into farms to support them in being the primary mechanism to pull carbon out of the air. And I think we can do that, and it's going to help our farms survive, as well as treat their animals better, treat our workers better, because again, when farms are struggling economically, they're going to do what everybody else does, which is pinch and cut where sometimes the externalities don't get included. And we need to make sure the impact on the environment is included, and farms can actually not only reverse their impact, they can really be a proactive solution to the climate crisis.
Hey, thanks, David. And I want to just say thank you to Rachel, because I believe you've got to hop off and teach a class. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm teaching in the environmental justice class at Vermont Law School. So it's very related. The students are talking about these issues, and I'll see if they have questions too and see if we can get it in the chat. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. And thanks to the Sierra Club for all the great work that you are doing. David, we do have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to try to get to a few of these here. But there's one that Betty and someone else had kind of made reference to, and that is some of the federal relief dollars that have been, COVID relief dollars that have been coming into the state. And I know that's a very big area and topic, but one of the areas that has received some of that funding is for broadband, for instance. And this is not a conversation primarily about broadband for sure, but there are implications for the climate and for the environment and all sorts of things. So I wanted to know if you had thoughts that you wanted to share about how those federal dollars are being used and what more we can be doing to address the incredible inequities that have also kind of been laid bare by this crisis. Especially as folks are having to work from home or care for kids or others at home. So anything you want to address there, please feel free. I know it's a lot, but take a piece of that.
There's plenty there, and I can be long-winded, I know, but I hope my answers have been okay so far. Yes. So with respect to broadband, I think there's a number of things. There was a lot of review of whether we could have put more into broadband with the initial CARES Act money, but unfortunately, we also didn't have the planned, sort of, let's immediately put up the fiber everywhere. Well, to do that efficiently and effectively, you actually have to have the plan in place. And where is broadband now, and where's the best places to get it next and first. And so that was not really a feasible option. However, with the legislation passed last year with the communication union districts and the planning going into those, we did put some CARES money into accelerating their ability to do that planning, so that if we get another wave of resources that would have the flexibility to start stringing the broadband, we could start doing that. Secondly, in my Green Mountain New Deal plan, which is again a cornerstone of my campaign, we would invest between $10 and $20 million a year in putting up the broadband, which would leverage both federal dollars that exist for rural broadband implementation, as well as these communication union districts being able to bond, as EC Fiber did as a municipality, to get more broadband up. And there is no doubt that broadband would be very helpful with the climate crisis. It would allow people to work from home instead of commuting. So what if folks work from home 1 or 2 days a week, maybe even 3? Well, that would reduce carbon emissions by 20, 40, or 60% with respect to commuting. Not all transportation is commuting, of course. But we know transportation is a huge sector of carbon emissions. And so if people could stay in place to do their work some days of the week, that would be wonderfully impactful to reduce our carbon emissions. Now, there's a flip side to that. I think we are more productive. And also as humans, we like true interaction. I would imagine everybody watching right now is so sick of looking at screens. So thank you for doing so at this moment in time to learn information about my campaign and these issues. But really, I do think it's important to still have in-person meetings. So I hope we don't go to 5-day-a-week commuting and just isolation in our living rooms. But if we had better broadband out in rural areas, you could also have, collective work environments in our town and village centers where 6 or 8 people or 15 people could work in a common space with their internet connections around the world, but also able to throw ideas at each other around a common, meeting room and so forth. So I think that the better broadband is a huge potential impact around climate. It's a huge impact around education. You addressed inequities as you asked the question, Paul, where we have rural folks and rural teachers unable to learn or teach in this current situation with any kind of adequate receptivity. It's also would be helpful to have better broadband with respect to information transfer, even around energy use. So as we become a more distributed energy production grid, we would also then have more capacity for the utilities to make sure the energy loads through our utility lines and others would be better monitored and therefore better adjusted if needed as we have more solar panels and wind in different parts of the state. So I think broadband is critically important.
Well, I mean, we certainly have seen that. And as a parent of a child whose school just shut down for today and the next week, we're seeing that in Montpelier. So, this is going to happen, and we've been advised to prepare ourselves for a challenging fall and winter. And despite the fact that Vermont has been doing a good job, and you see Vermonters wearing their masks by and large, this is still something we have to grapple with. Lauren, are you? Do you have a question identified?
Well, one issue we haven't talked about as much that we've gotten a couple questions on, and maybe David could speak to some of the questions have really come up in the context of farming, but you could also speak more broadly about clean water and what your vision in contrast to what we would anticipate from the current governor and what we've seen so far. So just speaking about how you would prioritize in your vision for ensuring clean, safe water for all Vermonters.
Yeah, I think we're still seeing, as many people know, large cyanobacteria outbreaks from the sort of legacy pollution that's been put into our waterways, as well as the contemporary additions that are happening. We still have combined sewer overflows that are often dumping pollutants into our waterways. We are seeing agricultural runoff continue, although thankfully with many newer practices being utilized, from not spreading as close to waterways to manure injection to more cover cropping, we're seeing that start to go in the right direction. So that's helpful. Earlier, I talked about carbon sequestration and cover crops. One of the advantages of that, not only in pulling carbon out of the air, is building organic matter in your soil helps the soil absorb more water, much like a sponge. And so as you have healthier soil, then we can absorb these heavier rains that are happening, as people are recognizing, of course, that we're getting more intensive rains instead of those long showers. Well, long showers go into the soil better. Intensive rains run off and pull, unfortunately, nutrients with it and pollute our waterways. So I think there's a number of things we need to do. We know that Burlington and some other municipalities are trying to separate their rainwater runoff from their sewer systems. That is a hugely expensive process and is going to take time, but thankfully we're seeing municipalities start to do that, and we hope to see those positive outputs or positive ramifications of those investments as we go forward. I know Burlington's done some rain garden runoff right along some roads so that it's absorbed and released more slowly. So there's a number of ways we need to invest to tackle the water quality issue, because as we know, water is life. We heard that term a lot during the protests and rallies around the Keystone Pipeline, but really it's a fundamental tenet of many Indigenous people. We're primarily water. We drink and need water every single day, even more so than food. If we go without water, clean water, our bodies would really struggle to survive. And we are what we eat, we are what we drink, we are what we breathe. And if we don't care for those things, we are harming ourselves. So if we don't come at it with that mentality, I think we're fooling ourselves and we're creating a much worse future for ourselves and our kids.
Thanks, David. And I want to say we had a great question or comment from Mary Collins, who says that you've been endorsed not just by the organizations that are hosting this town hall today, but by other notable figures who are concerned about environment and climate, including Senator Bernie Sanders and Bill McKibben, and I'm sure the list goes kind of on and on there. But there is a recognition that those who care deeply about these issues, who spend their lives working for better solutions to these issues, have recognized that you are a standout candidate and an outstanding leader, and someone that we would really be grateful to have as governor of this state. And I think it leads me to the question about what can all of the people who work with these organizations and others do to help promote your candidacy in the closing days of what is absolutely one of the most unusual election seasons and processes that any of us have ever seen before. I mean, there's never been anything like it, right? So how have you been approaching this, and how could you imagine people who do recognize the all the attributes that you bring to this, how can they help you in these closing days?
Well, really, the closing days are every day. It is probably going to be a reality this weekend that as many as 30 or 50,000 people sit down at their desks this weekend or their kitchen tables and vote their ballots. We've already had 170,000 ballots have been cast. Probably 50, maybe even more thousand will be cast this weekend because, of course, Secretary Condos and others were all recommending you get them in Monday's mail. Otherwise, bring them to your town clerk, your drop box, or bring them in on election day just to make sure none get lost in the mail or delayed in the mail. But I'd say there's a few things you can do, and it is imperative you do them immediately. Post on your front porch forum why you think it's important to vote for me. You could write that today, right after this call. It might go out either tonight or tomorrow morning, and put it in front of people right before they're going to vote. You could email your friends, just write an email and just send it to friend after friend after friend. You could post on social media immediately with respect to Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and reach people. You could call folks who might be a little older and don't use all these technologies to communicate, and just call 3 to 5 neighbors who are seniors and talk to them about how this election is going to impact them and their kids and their grandkids' future. Because right now, many people, this is what we know, there are a number of people out there who are saying, I like David, I like Phil, Phil's done a good job with COVID, I think I'm going to stick with Phil for the time being. And I think it's really important to bring up to them all of these issues we've talked about today, the bills that he's vetoed, and say, your vote has major consequences and will for the next 2 years. You can thank the governor with letters, with a phone call to his office. After I win, you can reach out to him and console him, but say, thank you. It wasn't because of COVID that we voted for David. It's because of these other issues. And something that really is critical that just broke yesterday is that Senator Bernie Sanders is in the running to be in a leadership position in the Biden administration. And many people don't realize that either his opportunity to do that may be thwarted if the Senate is a tie and Governor Scott is still governor as opposed to me being governor. And the reason for that is that the governor appoints a replacement for the serving senator if they no longer are in that position, whether it's through an appointment or unfortunately through a more dire or tragic situation. And so the Senate seats are in play with respect to the next governor of Vermont. And for many, it's important to remind them your vote for governor has consequences. It's not just a thank you. It's who's making these decisions. Are they going to veto bills like the Global Warming Solutions Act, toxic toys, the medical monitoring bills? Is it going to be implementing our budget with vision to build our economy in our rural areas for working people, our farmers, and getting people back to work and saving us energy and tackling the climate crisis? And is it really going to impact the future of the U.S. Senate that I know many Vermonters care about with the atrocity of a Mitch McConnell leadership of this Supreme Court justice appointee, which will have environmental consequences? The Supreme Court will rule on environmental issues. Therefore, the Senate matters. Therefore, who's in the governor's office matters. So use the information you've gotten tonight, spread the word, share this video, reach out in every way you can over the next 24, 48 hours and 10 days to the next election.
Hey, David, you've given a lot of great ideas for folks who have a time and interest to be able to get involved now. And for those who may have the financial capacity, it's not too late to make a contribution either, I think I could say.
That's right.
So As we are speaking, it's Friday, the 23rd of October, and if you've got all active registered voters in Vermont, of course, should have a ballot. If they haven't sent it in already, and if you're planning to mail it in, please do so tomorrow at the latest, is the advice from the Secretary of State, in order to make sure that it reaches your town clerk in time to be counted in this election. And of course, it is absolutely essential that no one is disenfranchised. We want you to participate. And if you don't mail it in, of course, look for, and there are safe opportunities to drop them off at many clerk offices, and there's a place on the VPIRG website that you can find about that, or contact your clerk and ask, how can I drop this off? And of course, we still have voting in person, and we just urge you, of course, to do that safely if you're going to participate that way in this election and in this process. But we would love to see people, however you're voting, to break records this year for participation. This is a great year. And it's such an important year in so many ways to get out and make your voice heard, and to do so safely. David, we've learned a lot about you and the work that you've done and the work that you would like to do further for Vermont and for our people and for our environment. And I want to say once again, thank you for your work, your career, your calling, and for all that you've done. And thanks for being with us here today. Thanks also to the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club, and for Vermont Conservation Voters, and obviously to VPIRG and all of our members for helping to make this a success, and for all of you for tuning in. There's more to learn. David has already given you his website, but one more time, David.
It is www.zuckerman4vt.com, and that's 4 spelled out FOR. So Zuckerman4Vermont.com. And I want to add one quick thing, Paul, which is that people can also still register to vote. You can register to vote up to and including the day of the election. You can literally walk in, register to vote, get a ballot, and vote. I just met some young people in Burlington yesterday that didn't know that, and I encouraged them. They said, well, I vote out of state. I said, great, get your ballot, mail it back to Colorado or wherever. But if you have friends that either don't receive their ballots, they don't get them in time, or they can't send them back, or if you have people that are just turning 18 and hadn't registered anywhere, you can register to vote in Vermont. Thankfully, we have some of the best laws in the country. VPIRG, you've done a huge amount of work on that over the years. Same day voter registration, and you can vote right then and there.
Just make sure you vote only once.
Yes.
And
that is true. Either vote there or here or wherever, but don't vote multiple times, 100%.
Thanks for that reminder. Really, really important. And no excuses not to participate in this election. And you've got a great candidate for governor right here. Thanks so much, David, for joining us. And thanks to everybody. And good luck.
Thank you.
That's it. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.